An evil nanny named Mrs. Jenkins discriminates against a black girl, Aaliyah, in daycare, believing her cruel actions will go unnoticed. But years later, she's shocked to encounter a familiar face in an unexpected place, and her regret is overwhelming. As their paths cross again, will Mrs. Jenkins face the consequences of her past? And will the tables finally turn? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Aaliyah clutched her mom's hand tightly as they walked up to the colorful door of Sunshine Daycare. The little girl's heart raced with a mix of excitement and worry. She'd never been away from her mom for so long before. "It'll be okay, sweetheart," Marissa said softly, giving Aaliyah's hand a gentle squeeze. "You're going to make new friends and have so much fun." Aaliyah looked up at her mom with big brown eyes. "Promise?" "I promise," Marissa replied with a warm smile. As they stepped inside, the smell of crayons and Play-Doh filled the air. Bright pictures covered the walls, and the sound of children laughing echoed from another room. Aaliyah's eyes widened as she took it all in. An older woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun approached them. Her face was set in a stern expression that made Aaliyah want to hide behind her mom's legs. "You must be Mrs. Lewis," the woman said, her voice as crisp as her ironed blouse. "I'm Mrs. Jenkins." Marissa nodded, trying to keep her smile in place. "Yes, and this is Aaliyah. It's her first day." Mrs. Jenkins barely glanced at Aaliyah before turning back to Marissa. "Very well, we have a strict schedule here. Drop-off is at 8 a.m. sharp, and pickup is at 5 p.m. No exceptions." Marissa felt a knot form in her stomach. Something about Mrs. Jenkins' tone made her uneasy. She knelt down next to Aaliyah, who was now half hidden behind her. "Sweetie, I have to go to work now," Marissa said gently. "But I'll be back to pick you up later, okay?" Aaliyah's lower lip trembled. "Can I go with you, Mommy?" Marissa's heart ached. "I wish you could, baby. But you're going to have a great day here, and when I pick you up, you can tell me all about it." She hugged Aaliyah tightly, breathing in the sweet smell of her daughter's hair. As she stood up, Mrs. Jenkins cleared her throat impatiently. "We don't coddle the children here," she said. "It's best if you leave quickly." Marissa bristled at the woman's words but forced herself to stay calm. She had no choice but to leave Aaliyah here. She needed to work, and this was the only daycare she could afford. "Be good, Aaliyah," Marissa said, blowing her daughter a kiss. "I love you." As Marissa walked out the door, she glanced back to see Aaliyah standing alone, looking small and lost. Mrs. Jenkins was already walking away, leaving the little girl by herself. Marissa's heart felt heavy as she headed to her car. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but what could she do? With a deep sigh, she started the engine, hoping against hope that her sweet Aaliyah would be okay. As the morning progressed, Aaliyah's eyes darted around the colorful playroom. She watched the other children laughing and playing together, her little heart aching to join them. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her courage and toddled over to a group building a tower with blocks. "Can I play too?" Aaliyah asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Before any of the children could respond, Mrs. Jenkins swooped in. "Aaliyah, come away from there," she said sharply. "You'll just knock it over." Aaliyah's lower lip trembled as Mrs. Jenkins steered her to a corner with a few tattered books. "You sit here and look at these," the older woman instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. Throughout the morning, Aaliyah tried again and again to join the other children. Each time, Mrs. Jenkins found a reason to keep her apart. When it was time for a snack, Mrs. Jenkins made sure Aaliyah sat at a table alone, while the other kids giggled and shared their cookies. During arts and crafts, Aaliyah reached for a bright red crayon at the same time as a little boy with blonde hair. Their hands touched, and the boy pulled back, sending the crayon rolling across the table. Mrs. Jenkins' eyes narrowed. "Aaliyah, we don't grab things from others," she scolded loudly, making the little girl shrink in her seat. "But I didn't," Aaliyah started to explain, her voice quivering. "No backtalk," Mrs. Jenkins cut her off. "If you can't behave, you'll have to sit in timeout." Tears welled up in Aaliyah's big brown eyes as she looked down at her empty paper. The other children stared at her, then quickly turned away, not wanting to catch Mrs. Jenkins's attention. As the day went on, Mrs. Jenkins found more reasons to scold Aaliyah. When a cup of water spilled, she blamed Aaliyah without seeing what happened. When toys were left on the floor, she made Aaliyah clean them up, even though she hadn't been playing with them. By nap time, Aaliyah felt completely alone. She curled up on her mat, hugging her knees to her chest, wishing more than anything that her mommy would come and take her home. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Sunshine Daycare, casting a warm glow on the children as they gathered around a large table. Mrs. Jenkins announced it was time for a special art project, and excited chatter filled the room. Little hands reached for brushes, and colorful paint pots dotted the table like a rainbow. Aaliyah's heart fluttered with hope. Maybe this time she thought she could join in without any trouble. She carefully picked up a brush, dipping it into a pot of bright yellow paint. Her small hand trembled slightly as she brought the brush to her paper. As she leaned forward to make her first stroke, her elbow bumped against the blue paint pot beside her. Time seemed to slow down as Aaliyah watched in horror as the pot tipped over, spilling its contents across the table and onto the floor. A collective gasp rose from the children. Aaliyah froze, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the growing puddle of blue at her feet. Mrs. Jenkins's head snapped up at the commotion. Her eyes narrowed as they landed on Aaliyah and the mess around her. "Aaliyah Lewis," she bellowed, her voice sharp enough to make the little girl flinch. "What have you done now?" Aaliyah's lower lip quivered as Mrs. Jenkins stormed over, her face red with anger. I'm sorry," Aaliyah whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was an accident." "An accident?" Mrs. Jenkins scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but trouble, child. Look at the mess you've made." The other children watched wide-eyed as Mrs. Jenkins continued to berate Aaliyah. Some began to giggle nervously, pointing at the blue paint that was now seeping into Aaliyah's shoes. "You've ruined the project for everyone," Mrs. Jenkins declared loudly, making sure all the children could hear. "Is that what you wanted? To spoil things for the good children?" Aaliyah's chest tightened as she struggled to hold back her tears. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor along with the spilled paint. The laughter of her classmates echoed in her ears, making her feel small and alone. "I think you need to sit in the corner and think about what you've done," Mrs. Jenkins said coldly, pointing to a chair facing the wall. "And you can forget about joining in the fun for the rest of the day." As the days passed, Marissa began to notice a change in her little girl. Aaliyah, once bubbly and full of life, now seemed to shrink into herself when they got home from daycare. Her usual chatter about her day had dwindled to quiet nods and shrugs. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Marissa watched Aaliyah push her food around her plate. The little girl's eyes were downcast, her shoulders slumped. Marissa's heart ached at the sight. "Sweetheart," Marissa said gently, reaching out to touch Aaliyah's hand. "Is everything okay at daycare? You seem a little sad lately." Aaliyah looked up, her big brown eyes filled with a sadness that no 4-year-old should know. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking her head. Marissa moved her chair closer, wrapping an arm around her daughter. "You know you can tell Mommy anything, right? If something's bothering you, I want to help." Aaliyah leaned into her mother's embrace but remained silent. Marissa could feel her daughter's tiny body trembling slightly. "Aaliyah, my sweet girl," Marissa said, her voice soft but firm. "I want you to remember something very important. No matter what anyone says or does, you must always be kind and stand tall." Aaliyah looked up at her mother, curiosity replacing some of the sadness in her eyes. "Being kind doesn't mean letting people be mean to you," Marissa explained. "It means being the bigger person, even when it's hard. And standing tall means knowing your worth, no matter what others might say." Marissa gently lifted Aaliyah's chin with her finger. "You are smart, beautiful, and so very special. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." A small smile tugged at the corners of Aaliyah's mouth. "Even if they're mean?" she asked in a tiny voice. "Especially if they're mean," Marissa replied, pulling her daughter close. "Sometimes people are unkind because they're hurting inside. But that doesn't make it right. And it doesn't change how wonderful you are." Aaliyah nodded, snuggling deeper into her mother's arms. Though she didn't share the details of her struggles at daycare, Marissa's words seemed to lift a weight from her small shoulders. As the weeks went by, Mrs. Jenkins's unfair treatment of Aaliyah continued. The elderly nanny seemed to find fault in everything the little girl did, no matter how hard she tried. One sunny morning, as the children played outside, Aaliyah tripped over a jump rope and scraped her knee. Instead of comforting her, Mrs. Jenkins scolded her harshly. "Clumsy girl," Mrs. Jenkins snapped, her wrinkled face twisted in a frown. "You should watch where you're going. Now look at the mess you've made." Aaliyah's lower lip trembled as she looked down at her scraped knee. It wasn't bleeding much, but it stung badly. She blinked back tears, remembering her mother's words about standing tall. The other children, who had been laughing and playing nearby, fell silent. They watched as Mrs. Jenkins roughly helped Aaliyah to her feet, muttering about carelessness. From that day on, the other kids started to follow Mrs. Jenkins's lead. When it was time to choose teams for games, Aaliyah was always picked last. During arts and crafts, no one wanted to share supplies with her. At snack time, she often sat alone, watching the other children giggle and chat. Aaliyah's heart felt heavy. She couldn't understand why everyone was being so mean to her. Was it something she had done? Was there something wrong with her? These questions swirled in her young mind, making her feel small and alone. One afternoon, as Aaliyah sat by herself during playtime, she overheard two girls whispering nearby. "Why is Aaliyah always alone?" one girl asked. "Mrs. Jenkins doesn't like her," the other replied matter-of-factly. "So we're not supposed to play with her." Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Why didn't Mrs. Jenkins like her? What had she done wrong? As the children gathered around the snack table, their eyes lit up with excitement. Mrs. Jenkins began handing out cookies, her wrinkled hands moving from child to child. Each time she placed a cookie on a plate, she added an extra one with a wink and a smile. "Here you go, sweetie," she cooed to a little blonde girl. "2 for you because you've been so good today." Aaliyah watched, her stomach tightening. She hoped that maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Jenkins would give her an extra cookie too. But when the elderly nanny reached her, her smile vanished. "Here," Mrs. Jenkins said curtly, dropping a single small cookie onto Aaliyah's plate. Aaliyah looked down at her lone cookie, then at the plates of her classmates, piled high with treats. Her lower lip quivered, but she remembered her mother's words about kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins," Aaliyah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Jenkins didn't respond. She just turned away, leaving Aaliyah alone at the end of the table. As the other children munched happily on their cookies, laughing and chatting, Aaliyah sat quietly. She nibbled on her small treat, trying not to cry. The laughter of her classmates seemed to grow louder, making her feel even more alone. A boy sitting nearby noticed Aaliyah's single cookie. He looked at his own plate, then back at hers. For a moment, it seemed like he might share. But then he caught Mrs. Jenkins watching and quickly turned away. Aaliyah's heart sank. She wanted so badly to be part of the group, to laugh and share like the others. But no matter how hard she tried, she always felt left out. As snack time came to an end, Aaliyah helped clean up, just like her mother had taught her. She gathered the empty plates and napkins, careful not to make a mess. But even as she tried to be helpful, she could feel Mrs. Jenkins' disapproving gaze following her every move. The day wore on, and Aaliyah's sadness grew. She tried to stay strong, to be kind like her mother said. But it was getting harder and harder to smile when no one smiled back. One sunny afternoon, Marissa arrived at Sunshine Daycare earlier than usual. As she approached the building, she heard a familiar voice raised in anger. Her heart sank as she recognized Mrs. Jenkins's harsh tone. "You clumsy girl, look at the mess you've made," Mrs. Jenkins scolded. Marissa quickened her pace, worry etched on her face. She peered through the window and saw Aaliyah standing near a small puddle of water, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jenkins," Aaliyah whimpered. "It was an accident." Mrs. Jenkins loomed over the little girl, her face twisted with frustration. Always making messes, always causing trouble. Why can't you be more like the other children?" Marissa's blood boiled. She burst through the door, startling both Mrs. Jenkins and Aaliyah. "What's going on here?" Marissa demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Mrs. Jenkins straightened up, her expression quickly shifting to a forced smile. "Oh, Mrs. Lewis, you're early today." Marissa rushed to Aaliyah, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Aaliyah nodded, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Marissa turned to Mrs. Jenkins, her eyes flashing. "I heard what you said to my daughter. Why are you treating her this way?" Mrs. Jenkins waved her hand dismissively. "I don't know what you're talking about. Aaliyah had a little accident, that's all. I was simply explaining the importance of being careful." Marissa shook her head in disbelief. "That's not what I heard. You were yelling at her, comparing her to other children. That's not okay." Mrs. Jenkins crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mrs. Lewis, I've been caring for children for decades. I know how to do my job." Marissa felt a surge of frustration. She wanted to argue more, to make Mrs. Jenkins understand how wrong her behavior was. But she could feel Aaliyah trembling in her arms, and she knew this wasn't the time or place. "We'll be leaving now," Marissa said firmly. She gathered Aaliyah's things and headed for the door, her daughter's hand clasped tightly in hers. As they walked to the car, Marissa's mind raced. She felt helpless and angry. How long had this been going on? What else had Aaliyah endured that she didn't know about? Looking down at her daughter's tear-stained face, Marissa made a silent vow. She would protect Aaliyah, no matter what it took. She wouldn't let anyone, especially not Mrs. Jenkins, make her beautiful, kind-hearted daughter feel small or unworthy ever again. That evening, Marissa sat with Aaliyah on their worn but cozy couch. The little girl's eyes were still puffy from crying, but she snuggled close to her mother, finding comfort in her warmth. "Aaliyah, sweetheart," Marissa began, her voice gentle. "I want to talk to you about what happened today." Aaliyah looked up, her big brown eyes filled with worry. "Am I in trouble, Mommy?" Marissa shook her head, smiling softly. "No, baby. You're not in trouble at all. I want to teach you something important." She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, people might not be nice to us. They might say mean things or treat us unfairly. But that doesn't mean we have to be mean back." Aaliyah's brow furrowed in confusion. "But why, Mommy? It hurts when Mrs. Jenkins is mean." Marissa nodded, her heart aching for her daughter. "I know it does, sweetheart. But being kind, even when others aren't, shows how strong and beautiful you are inside." She hugged Aaliyah closer. "When someone is unkind, take a deep breath and remember how special you are. You can say to yourself, 'I am kind, I am smart, and I am important.'" Aaliyah repeated the words softly, a small smile forming on her lips. "That's right," Marissa encouraged. "And you know what? Every time you choose kindness, you make the world a little brighter." The next day at daycare, Aaliyah tried to remember her mother's words. When Mrs. Jenkins scolded her for coloring outside the lines, Aaliyah took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "I am kind, I am smart, and I am important." Instead of crying, she smiled and said, "I'll try to do better next time, Mrs. Jenkins." Mrs. Jenkins looked surprised, but Aaliyah felt a small spark of pride in her chest. Later, when another child knocked over Aaliyah's block tower, she didn't get upset. Instead, she offered to help rebuild it together. The other child hesitated, then nodded, and they spent the afternoon playing happily. That evening, as Marissa tucked Aaliyah into bed, the little girl's eyes shone with excitement. "Mommy, I did it. I was kind today, even when it was hard." Marissa's heart swelled with pride and love. She pulled Aaliyah into a tight hug, feeling the strength of their bond. "I'm so proud of you, my brave girl," she whispered, kissing Aaliyah's forehead. As they cuddled together, Aaliyah felt safe and loved. She knew that no matter what happened at daycare, she had her mother's love to come home to. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but for Aaliyah, it felt like storm clouds were gathering. As soon as she stepped into Sunshine Daycare, she could sense something was different. Mrs. Jenkins's face was pinched tight, her eyes darting around the room like angry bees. "Aaliyah! Hurry up and put your backpack away!" Mrs. Jenkins snapped, her voice sharper than usual. Aaliyah quickly did as she was told, her little hands trembling slightly. She tried to remember her mother's words. "I am kind, I am smart, and I am important." But today, those words seemed to slip away like sand through her fingers. Throughout the morning, Mrs. Jenkins seemed to find fault with everything Aaliyah did. When Aaliyah raised her hand to answer a question, Mrs. Jenkins ignored her. When she finished her snack last, Mrs. Jenkins tutted loudly and muttered about slow pokes. The other children noticed Mrs. Jenkins' mood and stayed far away from Aaliyah, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. Aaliyah felt more alone than ever. During playtime, Aaliyah tried to keep to herself, quietly stacking some blocks in the corner. But as she reached for another block, her elbow accidentally knocked into a nearby shelf. A cascade of toys clattered to the floor, the noise seeming to echo through the suddenly silent room. Mrs. Jenkins whirled around, her face red with anger. "Aaliyah Lewis!" she shouted, stomping over. "Look at the mess you've made! Can't you do anything right?" The other children stared, wide-eyed and silent. Aaliyah's lower lip began to tremble. I'm sorry, Mrs. Jenkins," she whispered. "It was an accident." But Mrs. Jenkins wasn't listening. She continued to berate Aaliyah, her voice getting louder with each word. "You're always causing trouble. Why can't you be more like the other children? Maybe you just don't belong here." It was too much for little Aaliyah. The tears she had been holding back all day finally spilled over. She began to cry, her small shoulders shaking with each sob. As the day wore on, Aaliyah wiped away her tears and took a deep breath. She remembered her mother's words about kindness and decided to try one last time to make friends. During free play, she gathered her courage and approached a group of children playing with colorful building blocks. "Hi," Aaliyah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I play with you? I have some nice dolls we could use too." The children looked up, their eyes darting between Aaliyah and Mrs. Jenkins, who was watching from across the room with a disapproving frown. One little girl opened her mouth as if to say yes, but then quickly shut it when she saw Mrs. Jenkins shake her head. "No," a boy said firmly. "We don't want to play with you. Mrs. Jenkins says you're always causing trouble." Aaliyah's heart sank. She clutched her doll tighter and tried again. "But I promise I'll be careful. We could have fun together." The children turned their backs on her, ignoring her completely. Aaliyah stood there for a moment, feeling invisible and unwanted. She could feel Mrs. Jenkins's cold stare on her back, and it made her want to disappear. With heavy steps, Aaliyah walked to a corner of the room and sat down alone. She hugged her doll close, pretending it was giving her a big, warm hug. Tears pricked at her eyes again, but this time she didn't let them fall. As she sat there watching the other children laugh and play, Aaliyah felt a small spark of something new inside her. It wasn't anger or sadness, but a tiny flame of determination. She thought about her mother's smile, her gentle words, and how she always said Aaliyah was special. "I won't let this make me mean," Aaliyah whispered to her doll. "Even if they don't like me, I'll still be kind. That's what Mommy would want." Years passed and life had taken its toll on Mrs. Jenkins. Now retired and living alone in a small, cluttered apartment, she was a shadow of her former self. Her once stern face was etched with deep wrinkles, and her hands, once quick to point out others' faults, were now gnarled and painful with arthritis. Every morning, Mrs. Jenkins struggled to get out of bed, her joints creaking in protest. Simple tasks like making breakfast or getting dressed became monumental challenges. She winced as she slowly made her way to the kitchen, leaning heavily on her worn wooden cane. "Oh, Lord," she muttered, her voice thin and raspy. "Another day of this misery." As she sipped her lukewarm tea, Mrs. Jenkins's eyes fell on a stack of unpaid medical bills on the table. Her meager pension wasn't enough to cover her mounting healthcare costs, and the arthritis medication she desperately needed was far beyond her reach. Tears welled up in her eyes as she remembered the days when she was in charge, when she commanded respect, or at least fear, from the children at Sunshine Daycare. Now she was alone, forgotten, and in constant pain. One particularly difficult morning, after a sleepless night filled with aches and regrets, Mrs. Jenkins made a decision. She couldn't go on like this anymore. With trembling hands, she picked up a flyer she'd been avoiding for weeks. It advertised a free clinic in the city, offering basic medical care to those who couldn't afford it. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've got no choice now." Gathering what little strength she had, Mrs. Jenkins put on her best outfit, a faded floral dress she'd had for years, and carefully applied a touch of lipstick. She may have fallen on hard times, but she still had her pride. With her cane in one hand and her purse clutched tightly in the other, Mrs. Jenkins slowly made her way out of her apartment and down to the bus stop. Each step was agony, but she pressed on, driven by desperation and the faint hope of finding some relief. As she boarded the bus, Mrs. Jenkins had no idea what awaited her at the clinic. She was simply an old woman in pain, seeking help in a world that seemed to have forgotten her. Mrs. Jenkins shuffled into the clinic, her cane tapping a slow rhythm on the worn linoleum floor. The waiting room was bustling with activity, filled with people from all walks of life. She felt small and insignificant, a far cry from the commanding presence she once was at Sunshine Daycare. Finding an empty seat, Mrs. Jenkins lowered herself gingerly, wincing as her joints protested. She clutched her purse tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. The shame of her situation weighed heavily on her shoulders, making her slouch even more. "Mrs. Jenkins?" a nurse called out, her voice kind but firm. With a deep breath, Mrs. Jenkins struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her cane. She followed the nurse down a narrow hallway, her heart pounding with anxiety. What would the doctor think of her? Would they judge her for letting herself get to this state? The nurse ushered her into a small examination room. "Dr. Lewis will be with you shortly," she said with a reassuring smile before closing the door. Mrs. Jenkins perched on the edge of the examination table, her feet dangling like a child's. She smoothed her dress nervously, trying to make herself look more presentable. A soft knock on the door made her jump. "Come in," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The door opened and a young woman in a white coat stepped in. Her warm brown eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "Hello, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm Dr. Aaliyah Lewis. How are you today?" Mrs. Jenkins blinked, taken aback by the doctor's youth and friendliness. I've been better, dear," she admitted, her voice quavering. As Dr. Lewis began asking questions about her symptoms, Mrs. Jenkins found herself relaxing slightly. There was something familiar about the doctor's name, but she couldn't quite place it. It niggled at the back of her mind, making her feel uneasy. "Aaliyah Lewis," Mrs. Jenkins murmured, more to herself than to the doctor. "Why does that name sound so familiar?" Dr. Lewis paused in her examination, her eyes meeting Mrs. Jenkins. For a moment, something flickered across her face, recognition perhaps. But it was gone so quickly that Mrs. Jenkins wasn't sure she'd seen it at all. "Now let's see what we can do about that arthritis of yours, shall we?" As the appointment continued, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. The name Aaliyah Lewis kept echoing in her mind, bringing with it a vague sense of discomfort and regret. As Dr. Lewis gently examined Mrs. Jenkins's swollen joints, the elderly woman's discomfort grew. It wasn't just the physical pain that bothered her. There was something unsettling about this young doctor that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Mrs. Jenkins watched Dr. Lewis closely, her brow furrowed in concentration. The doctor's gentle touch and kind demeanor stirred something in her memory. Those warm brown eyes, the soft curve of her smile, they seemed hauntingly familiar. Have we met before, Dr. Lewis?" Mrs. Jenkins asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Lewis paused for a moment, her hand still resting on Mrs. Jenkins' wrist. She looked up, meeting the older woman's gaze with a calm, steady expression. "We may have, Mrs. Jenkins, but right now let's focus on getting you feeling better, okay?" As Aaliyah continued her examination, memories flickered through her mind. She remembered clearly the stern face of the nanny who had made her childhood so difficult, the sting of unfair treatment, the isolation, the tears she had shed, It all came rushing back. Yet here she was, treating that same woman with the utmost care and professionalism. Mrs. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably on the examination table, wincing as Dr. Lewis carefully bent her knee. "You're very gentle, dear," she murmured, a hint of surprise in her voice. "Not many doctors these days take the time to be so kind." Aaliyah smiled softly, her heart filled with a mix of emotions. "Kindness is important in healing, Mrs. Jenkins, both for the body and the soul." As the appointment progressed, Mrs. Jenkins found herself relaxing despite her lingering unease. There was something about Dr. Lewis that made her feel safe, cared for. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, and it brought a lump to her throat. Aaliyah, for her part, remained the picture of professionalism. She treated Mrs. Jenkins with the same compassion and care she showed all her patients, pushing aside the memories of her painful past. Yet, as she worked, she couldn't help but feel a sense of irony at the situation. The woman who had once treated her so coldly was now dependent on her care. As Dr. Lewis continued her examination, a sudden flash of recognition hit Mrs. Jenkins like a bolt of lightning. Those kind eyes, that gentle touch. It all made sense now. This wasn't just any doctor. This was Aaliyah, the little girl she had treated so cruelly all those years ago at Sunshine Daycare. Mrs. Jenkins felt her chest tighten, her breath catching in her throat. Shame and guilt washed over her in waves, threatening to drown her. How could she face this woman now, knowing what she had done? The weight of her past actions pressed down on her, making her feel small and insignificant. I think we're done here," Mrs. Jenkins stammered, her voice trembling. She tried to push herself up from the examination table, desperate to escape the suffocating guilt. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Lewis, but I really must be going." Aaliyah looked up, concern etched on her face. "Mrs. Jenkins, we haven't finished the examination yet. Are you feeling all right?" As Mrs. Jenkins attempted to stand, a sharp pain shot through her knees. She gasped, her legs buckling beneath her. Aaliyah quickly moved to support her, helping her back onto the table. "Please, Mrs. Jenkins, you need to rest," Aaliyah said softly, her hand steady on the older woman's arm. "Your knees are in no condition for you to leave right now." Mrs. Jenkins sank back onto the table, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. She couldn't bring herself to look at Aaliyah, instead, fixing her gaze on her own gnarled hands. The shame burned inside her, a constant reminder of her past cruelty. Aaliyah, noticing the sudden change in Mrs. Jenkins' demeanor, spoke gently. "Is everything okay? You seem upset." Mrs. Jenkins remained silent, the words stuck in her throat. How could she possibly explain? How could she face the kindness of this woman she had once treated so unfairly? Mrs. Jenkins sat there, her shoulders slumped and her eyes fixed on the floor. She couldn't bring herself to look at Dr. Lewis, the shame of her past actions weighing heavily on her heart. The urge to flee was strong, but her aching knees kept her rooted to the examination table. "Mrs. Jenkins," Dr. Lewis said gently, "I need to continue the examination. Is that all right?" The elderly woman nodded weakly, still avoiding eye contact. She desperately wanted to confess, to apologize for her cruel treatment of little Aaliyah all those years ago. But the words caught in her throat, choking her with guilt. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Jenkins, Dr. Lewis had recognized her former tormentor the moment she walked into the clinic. Yet there was no hint of anger or resentment in her demeanor. With practiced hands, she continued her examination, her touch gentle and professional. "I'm going to check your range of motion now," Dr. Lewis explained, carefully manipulating Mrs. Jenkins's knee. "Please let me know if you feel any pain." As Dr. Lewis worked, Mrs. Jenkins marveled at the kindness in her voice, the care in her actions. How could this woman, whom she had treated so terribly as a child, show such compassion now? "Your arthritis is quite advanced," Dr. Lewis said, making notes on her clipboard. "But there are treatments we can try to help manage your pain and improve your mobility." Mrs. Jenkins nodded mutely, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to confess, to beg for forgiveness. But fear held her back. Fear of rejection. Fear of seeing hatred in those kind eyes. Dr. Lewis continued her examination, explaining each step with patience and clarity. She showed no sign of the hurt little girl Mrs. Jenkins remembered. Instead, she was the picture of professionalism and compassion, treating her difficult patient with the same care she would give anyone else. Mrs. Jenkins hobbled into the clinic for her follow-up appointment, her heart heavy with guilt. The weight of her past actions seemed to press down on her shoulders, making each step more difficult than the last. As she settled into the waiting room chair, her mind wandered back to those days at Sunshine Daycare, replaying every harsh word and unkind gesture she had directed at little Aaliyah. When Dr. Lewis called her name, Mrs. Jenkins startled, her arthritic hands trembling as she gripped her walking cane. She shuffled into the examination room, her eyes downcast, unable to meet the doctor's gaze. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," Dr. Lewis greeted warmly. "How have you been feeling since our last appointment?" Mrs. Jenkins mumbled a response, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't focus on the questions about her arthritis or the pain in her joints. All she could think about was the past, the shame burning in her chest like a hot coal. Dr. Lewis, ever the professional, began her examination with gentle efficiency. She checked Mrs. Jenkins's range of motion, carefully manipulating her swollen joints. "I'm going to apply some pressure here," she explained softly. "Please let me know if it hurts." As Dr. Lewis worked, Mrs. Jenkins marveled at the kindness in her touch. How could this woman, whom she had treated so cruelly as a child, show such compassion now? The contrast between her own past behavior and Dr. Lewis's current professionalism was stark, making Mrs. Jenkins feel even more wretched. "Your inflammation seems to have decreased slightly," Dr. Lewis noted, making entries in Mrs. Jenkins's chart. "The medication appears to be helping. How are you managing with the exercises I showed you?" Mrs. Jenkins struggled to concentrate on the question. Her mind kept drifting back to little Aaliyah's tear-stained face, to the sound of her own harsh voice echoing through the daycare. She mumbled something about trying her best with the exercises, her voice thick with unshed tears. Dr. Lewis continued the appointment, explaining treatment options and demonstrating new stretches to help with Mrs. Jenkins' mobility. Through it all, she maintained her calm, caring demeanor, treating her patient with the utmost respect and attention. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Jenkins' appointments with Dr. Lewis continued. Each visit brought a mix of physical relief and emotional turmoil for the elderly woman. The gentle care she received from Dr. Lewis only intensified her feelings of guilt and shame. During one particularly difficult session, Mrs. Jenkins winced as Dr. Lewis examined her swollen knees. The pain in her joints was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. She couldn't bear the weight of her secret any longer. With trembling hands, Mrs. Jenkins gripped the edge of the examination table. She took a deep breath, her voice quavering as she spoke. "Dr. Lewis, I hope you don't mind me asking, but did you ever attend Sunshine Daycare as a child?" Dr. Lewis paused, her hand still resting gently on Mrs. Jenkins's knee. She looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting Mrs. Jenkins's anxious gaze. "Yes, I did," she replied softly. "It was a long time ago, but I remember it well." The confirmation hit Mrs. Jenkins like a tidal wave. Her worst fears were realized, and the full weight of her past actions came crashing down upon her. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she struggled to catch her breath. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Jenkins whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I was there. I was the nanny who treated you so terribly." Dr. Lewis remained still, her expression unreadable. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Mrs. Jenkins' quiet sobs. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Jenkins continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I was wrong, so very wrong. The way I treated you, it was unforgivable. I've carried this guilt for years, and I don't know how to make it right." Mrs. Jenkins's shoulders shook as she tried to compose herself. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks, leaving glistening trails in their wake. Her voice trembled with each word, barely above a whisper. I don't know where to begin," she stammered, her hands twisting in her lap. "What I did to you was terrible. So terrible." Aaliyah stood quietly, her face a mask of calm. She didn't interrupt, allowing Mrs. Jenkins the space to continue. "You were just a little girl," Mrs. Jenkins went on, her words coming out in short, choked bursts. "So sweet and innocent. And I was so cruel. I let my own prejudices blind me. I treated you unfairly, singled you out, made you feel less than." She paused, taking a shaky breath. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts and brimming with tears, searched Aaliyah's face for any sign of reaction. "I've thought about it every day since," Mrs. Jenkins confessed. "The shame, the guilt. It's eaten away at me. I know I can never undo what I did, but I need you to know how sorry I am. How deeply, truly sorry." Aaliyah remained silent, her posture relaxed, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Jenkins. There was no anger in her gaze, no hint of the hurt little girl she once was. She simply listened, allowing Mrs. Jenkins to unburden herself. "I was wrong, so very wrong," Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice cracking. "I let my own biases control me, and I hurt an innocent child. You didn't deserve any of it. You were always such a good girl, always trying your best. And I failed you. I failed as a caregiver, as a teacher, as a human being." Mrs. Jenkins' words trailed off into quiet sobs. She hunched over, her frail body shaking with the force of her emotions. The weight of her past actions seemed to physically press down on her, making her appear even smaller and more vulnerable. Aaliyah took a deep breath, her eyes softening as she looked at the frail, weeping woman before her. With gentle steps, she moved closer to Mrs. Jenkins and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Jenkins," Aaliyah said, her voice calm and steady, "I forgave you a long time ago." The older woman's sobs quieted, and she looked up at Aaliyah with disbelief etched across her tear-stained face. Aaliyah continued, her words measured and kind. "What happened at the daycare was painful, yes, but my mother taught me something important back then. She showed me how to rise above hurt and become stronger because of it." Mrs. Jenkins listened, her mouth slightly open in astonishment. "My mom always told me to be kind no matter what," Aaliyah explained, a small smile tugging at her lips. "She said that how others treat us doesn't define who we are. It's how we respond that matters." Aaliyah's eyes grew misty as she remembered her mother's words. "She taught me that forgiveness isn't just for the person who hurt us, it's for our own peace too, and that's what helped me move forward." Mrs. Jenkins stared at Aaliyah, utterly speechless. Tears continued to fall, but now they were mixed with a sense of awe and relief. "You see, Mrs. Jenkins," Aaliyah said softly, "those difficult days at the daycare didn't break me. They made me want to help others even more. They're part of why I became a doctor." Mrs. Jenkins tried to speak, but no words came out. She was overwhelmed by Aaliyah's forgiveness and the profound impact of her mother's teachings. Aaliyah gave Mrs. Jenkins' shoulder a gentle squeeze. "So please don't carry this burden anymore. I've forgiven you, and I hope you can forgive yourself too." Mrs. Jenkins' body shook with a fresh wave of emotion. She covered her face with her hands, overcome by Aaliyah's compassion and the weight of the moment. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Jenkins continued her treatment under Dr. Aaliyah Lewis's care. Each visit brought a mix of emotions for the elderly woman. The guilt that had once consumed her began to ease, replaced by a growing sense of humility and deep gratitude toward Aaliyah. During one of her appointments, Mrs. Jenkins watched in awe as Aaliyah gently manipulated her arthritic joints. The doctor's hands were skilled and tender, a stark contrast to the harsh treatment she had once inflicted on the young Aaliyah. "You're so patient with me, Dr. Lewis," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. Aaliyah looked up from her work and smiled warmly. "It's my job to help, Mrs. Jenkins, and I truly want you to feel better." Those simple words struck a chord in Mrs. Jenkins's heart. She marveled at Aaliyah's strength of character, how she had turned past pain into a force for good. As she sat in the waiting room after her appointment, Mrs. Jenkins found herself lost in thought. She reflected on her own life, the choices she had made, and the person she had become. The stark difference between her past actions and Aaliyah's current kindness was impossible to ignore. "I've wasted so much time being bitter," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. Mrs. Jenkins realized that it wasn't too late to change. Aaliyah's forgiveness had opened a door, showing her a path to redemption she never thought possible. She decided then and there that she would try to be better, to show the same kindness to others that Aaliyah had shown her. On her way out of the clinic, Mrs. Jenkins paused by the reception desk. With trembling hands, she picked up a volunteer information pamphlet. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She tucked it into her purse, a small smile playing on her lips. As she stepped out into the sunshine, Mrs. Jenkins felt lighter than she had in years. The guilt was still there, a reminder of her past, but it no longer weighed her down completely. Instead, it fueled her desire to change, to make amends in whatever way she could. Mrs. Jenkins arrived for her next appointment with Dr. Aaliyah Lewis, her heart heavy with emotions she could no longer contain. As Aaliyah began her examination, Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Dr. Lewis," she began, her voice quivering, "I can't express how grateful I am for your care, not just as my doctor, but for the kindness you've shown me despite our history." Aaliyah paused her work, giving Mrs. Jenkins her full attention. The elderly woman's eyes welled up with tears as she continued. "I've been haunted by guilt for years, you know. The way I treated you when you were just a little girl. It's unforgivable. And yet, here you are, treating me with such compassion." Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, a tear rolling down her wrinkled cheek. "I never imagined I'd have a chance to make amends. I thought I'd carry this shame to my grave." Aaliyah listened patiently, her face a picture of calm understanding. Mrs. Jenkins marveled at the woman before her, remembering the shy little girl she had once mistreated. "You've grown into such a wonderful person, Dr. Lewis. Despite the hardships you faced, hardships I caused, you've become this kind, successful doctor. I can't help but wonder how you did it." Mrs. Jenkins's voice cracked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything I put you through, and I'm in awe of the person you've become, your strength, your kindness. It's truly remarkable." Aaliyah reached out and gently patted Mrs. Jenkins's hand, a gesture that nearly undid the older woman. The simple act of comfort spoke volumes about Aaliyah's character. "I want you to know," Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that your forgiveness means more to me than you could ever imagine. It's given me a chance to reflect on my life and the person I've been. I want to do better, to be better." Aaliyah listened carefully to Mrs. Jenkins's heartfelt words, her eyes filled with compassion. As the older woman finished speaking, Aaliyah took a moment to gather her thoughts before responding. "Mrs. Jenkins," she began softly, "my mother always taught me to be kind, no matter what life throws at us." Aaliyah's voice was gentle but firm, her words carrying the weight of years of reflection. "You see, my experiences throughout the years, including those difficult times at the daycare, taught me valuable lessons. They showed me the importance of humility and kindness." Mrs. Jenkins listened intently, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and admiration. Aaliyah continued, her voice steady and warm. "The kindness you see in me now isn't just a result of forgiveness. It's a reflection of the strength I gained from overcoming the past. Those challenges helped shape me into the person I am today." Aaliyah leaned forward slightly, her gaze meeting Mrs. Jenkins's tear-filled eyes. "My mother's words stayed with me all these years. She would always say, 'Aaliyah, be kind, even when it's hard. That's when it matters most.'" A small smile played on Aaliyah's lips as she remembered her mother's wisdom. "So you see, Mrs. Jenkins, the kindness I show isn't just for you. It's for me, too. It's a reminder of how far I've come and the person I've chosen to be." Mrs. Jenkins nodded slowly, absorbing Aaliyah's words. The doctor's calm demeanor and thoughtful response touched her deeply, showing her a glimpse of the incredible journey Aaliyah had been on. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, her voice filled with respect. Aaliyah's smile widened. She is. And her lessons helped me turn those difficult experiences into stepping stones rather than stumbling blocks. As Aaliyah spoke, Mrs. Jenkins could see the quiet strength that radiated from her. It was a stark contrast to the timid little girl she remembered, and it filled her with a sense of awe and regret. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Jenkins continued her treatment under Dr. Aaliyah Lewis's care. The older woman's arthritis slowly improved, but something else was changing too. The tension that had initially filled the air during their appointments began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. One afternoon, as Aaliyah gently manipulated Mrs. Jenkins's joints, the older woman sighed heavily. "You know, Dr. Lewis," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "I never thought I'd end up like this. Old, alone, and relying on the kindness of someone I once treated so poorly." Aaliyah paused her movements, giving Mrs. Jenkins her full attention. The elderly woman's eyes were distant, lost in memories. "These past few years have been difficult," Mrs. Jenkins continued. "After I retired, it seemed like everyone just forgot about me. My family rarely visits, and I don't have many friends left." Aaliyah nodded sympathetically, encouraging Mrs. Jenkins to continue. The older woman's shoulders slumped as she spoke. "Most days I sit alone in my apartment watching the world go by outside my window. It's a lonely existence, Dr. Lewis, and it gives me far too much time to think about my past mistakes." Mrs. Jenkins's voice cracked slightly, and Aaliyah instinctively reached out, placing a comforting hand on her arm. The gesture seemed to give Mrs. Jenkins strength to continue. "I never married, you know, never had children of my own. I thought my work at the daycare was enough, but now I see how wrong I was, how much damage I did." Aaliyah listened intently, her face a picture of compassion. She didn't interrupt, allowing Mrs. Jenkins the space to express her feelings. "It's ironic, isn't it?" Mrs. Jenkins said with a bitter laugh. "I spent my life surrounded by children, yet now, in my twilight years, I find myself utterly alone." Aaliyah squeezed Mrs. Jenkins' arm gently. "It's never too late to make connections, Mrs. Jenkins," she said softly. "You're not alone now." Mrs. Jenkins looked up at Aaliyah, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The doctor's kind words seemed to open a floodgate, and Mrs. Jenkins found herself sharing more about her daily struggles, the difficulty of grocery shopping with her aching joints, the fear of falling with no one to check on her, the crushing silence of her empty apartment. Inspired by Aaliyah's compassion and forgiveness, Mrs. Jenkins felt a stirring in her heart. She realized that while she couldn't change her past, she still had time to make a difference in the present. With newfound determination, she decided to volunteer at the local community center. On her first day, Mrs. Jenkins nervously approached the front desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she signed in, but the warm smile of the receptionist helped ease her anxiety. She was directed to a small meeting room where a group of seniors had gathered for a weekly social hour. As Mrs. Jenkins entered the room, she felt all eyes turned to her. For a moment, she hesitated, remembering how she once made Aaliyah feel so isolated. But then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped forward. "Hello," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My name is Mrs. Jenkins, and I'm here to volunteer." The group welcomed her warmly, and soon Mrs. Jenkins found herself engaged in conversation. As they chatted, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Jenkins became a regular fixture at the community center. She helped organize activities, served refreshments, and most importantly, listened to the stories of others. But as she grew more comfortable, she felt a growing urge to share her own story. One afternoon, during a quiet moment, Mrs. Jenkins cleared her throat. "I'd like to share something with you all," she began, her voice trembling slightly. The room fell silent as she recounted her past at the daycare, her mistreatment of Aaliyah, and the unexpected redemption she found years later. As she spoke, Mrs. Jenkins saw understanding and empathy in the eyes of those around her. Some nodded in recognition of their own past mistakes, while others reached out to pat her hand supportively. "I'm not proud of who I was," Mrs. Jenkins concluded, wiping a tear from her eye. But thanks to the kindness and forgiveness of that little girl, now a remarkable doctor, I've learned that it's never too late to change, to make amends, to do better. Mrs. Jenkins's story of transformation resonated deeply with the community center members. Inspired by their positive response, she felt a calling to share her experience more widely. With trembling hands, she dialed the number for a local radio station that hosted a weekly segment on community stories. To her surprise, they eagerly invited her to speak on air. The day of the broadcast, Mrs. Jenkins sat nervously in front of the microphone, her heart pounding. As the red light blinked on, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "I used to be a different person," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I held on to prejudices that hurt an innocent child. But through an unexpected twist of fate, I learned the power of kindness and forgiveness." As Mrs. Jenkins recounted her story, listeners called in, moved by her honesty and the message of hope. The station was flooded with requests for her to speak at schools and community events. Over the following months, Mrs. Jenkins found herself standing before diverse audiences, from elementary school children to senior citizen groups. Each time, she shared her journey from prejudice to understanding, emphasizing the transformative power of kindness. "We all have biases," she would say, her eyes scanning the crowd. "But it's never too late to change, to open our hearts and minds to others who may seem different from us." At one particularly memorable event, a local diversity forum, Mrs. Jenkins spoke about the impact of seemingly small acts of discrimination. "Every unkind word, every unfair action, leaves a mark," she explained, her voice filled with emotion. "But equally, every act of kindness has the power to heal and transform." As she continued to share her story, Mrs. Jenkins noticed a shift in herself. The guilt that had once weighed her down was slowly being replaced by a sense of purpose. She wasn't just seeking forgiveness anymore. She was actively working to create positive change in her community. Aaliyah's car pulled up to the modest house where Mrs. Jenkins lived. She stepped out, carrying a small bag of groceries and her medical kit. It had become a routine for her to visit Mrs. Jenkins after each treatment session, checking on her progress and offering companionship. As she knocked on the door, Aaliyah heard the slow shuffle of Mrs. Jenkins' footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing the older woman's wrinkled face, now softened by a gentle smile. "Dr. Lewis," Mrs. Jenkins greeted warmly. "Please come in." Aaliyah stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender filling her nostrils. She helped Mrs. Jenkins to her favorite armchair, then set about preparing tea in the small kitchen. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Jenkins?" Aaliyah asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Mrs. Jenkins flexed her fingers slowly. "Better, thanks to you. The pain isn't as bad anymore." Aaliyah nodded, bringing over 2 steaming cups of tea. She sat across from Mrs. Jenkins, and for a moment, they sipped in comfortable silence. "You know," Mrs. Jenkins began, her eyes misty with emotion, "I never thought I'd find peace after what I did, but your forgiveness, it's changed everything." Aaliyah reached out and gently patted Mrs. Jenkins's hand. "Forgiveness isn't just for the person who's done wrong, it frees us both." They sat together, 2 women from different generations, brought together by a painful past, but united in healing. As the afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, they shared stories and reflections. "Life has a funny way of bringing people together," Mrs. Jenkins mused, her gaze distant. "Who would have thought that little girl I was so unkind to would grow up to be the one to help me in my old age?" Aaliyah nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. "It's a reminder that every interaction we have, every choice we make, can have far-reaching consequences. But it also shows us that it's never too late to make things right." As the weeks passed, Mrs. Jenkins's arthritis began to show significant improvement. The pain that once plagued her joints eased, allowing her to move with greater freedom. Her regular treatments with Dr. Aaliyah Lewis, combined with the exercises she diligently practiced at home, were paying off. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins decided to take a walk in the local park. She moved slowly but steadily, her cane tapping a gentle rhythm on the path. As she rested on a bench, she noticed a young mother struggling with a fussy toddler nearby. Without hesitation, Mrs. Jenkins called out, "Are you all right, dear? Can I lend a hand?" The mother looked up, surprised and relieved. "Oh, thank you. Could you just watch my bag while I change him?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded, smiling warmly. As the mother tended to her child, Mrs. Jenkins struck up a conversation. She shared a bit of her story, speaking of the mistakes she had made and the unexpected kindness that had changed her life. The young mother listened intently, her eyes widening. "That's incredible," she said. "It's so easy to judge others without thinking. Your story, it really makes me want to be more mindful." This encounter sparked something in Mrs. Jenkins. She realized that her experiences could help others learn and grow. With renewed purpose, she began to reach out more in her community. She started volunteering at the local community center, sharing her story with groups of all ages. Her talks weren't just about her past mistakes, but about the transformative power of forgiveness and the importance of treating everyone with kindness and respect. "We all have biases," she would say, her voice strong despite her age. "But it's never too late to recognize them and change. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance." Her words resonated with many, and soon Mrs. Jenkins found herself becoming a source of support and wisdom in her neighborhood. People would seek her out for advice, drawn by her honesty and the hard-earned lessons she shared. As her health stabilized, Mrs. Jenkins's spirit soared. She had found a new purpose in life, one that allowed her to turn her past mistakes into valuable lessons for others. With each person she helped, each mind she opened, she felt a little more of the old guilt wash away, replaced by a deep sense of fulfillment. As Aaliyah's medical practice flourished, her reputation for exceptional care and compassion spread throughout the community. Patients sought her out, not just for her surgical skills, but for her kind and understanding demeanor. The lessons of grace and forgiveness that her mother had instilled in her continued to shape every aspect of her professional life. One busy afternoon, Aaliyah found herself dealing with a particularly difficult patient. The man was angry and frustrated, lashing out at the staff and complaining about everything. Instead of responding with irritation, Aaliyah took a deep breath and remembered her mother's words. "Always be kind, even when it's hard." With patience and gentleness, Aaliyah spoke to the man, listening to his concerns and addressing them one by one. By the end of the appointment, the patient's anger had melted away, replaced by gratitude for her understanding. As she finished her notes, Aaliyah's thoughts drifted to Mrs. Jenkins. Their unlikely bond had become a source of strength for her, a constant reminder of the power of forgiveness. She smiled, thinking of how far they had both come. Later that week, Aaliyah visited Mrs. Jenkins at her home. They sat together on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset. Mrs. Jenkins spoke of her latest community outreach efforts, her eyes bright with purpose. "You know, Aaliyah," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, "I never imagined that the little girl I once treated so poorly would become such an important part of my life. Your forgiveness. It changed everything for me." Aaliyah reached out and squeezed Mrs. Jenkins's hand. "And your transformation reminds me every day why forgiveness matters," she replied. "My mother always said that holding on to anger only hurts ourselves. Seeing how you've grown, how you're helping others now, it proves she was right." On a warm Saturday afternoon, Aaliyah made her way to the local community center. The sun shone brightly, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood as she walked up the steps. Inside, the room buzzed with excitement as people gathered for a special event. Mrs. Jenkins stood at the front, her silver hair neatly styled and her eyes twinkling with anticipation. As Aaliyah quietly took a seat in the back, she couldn't help but feel proud of how far Mrs. Jenkins had come. The room fell silent as Mrs. Jenkins began to speak. Her voice, once harsh and cold, now carried warmth and humility. She shared her story, not shying away from the mistakes of her past. "I was not always the person you see before you today," Mrs. Jenkins admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "There was a time when I let my prejudices guide my actions, and I hurt an innocent child because of it." As she spoke, her eyes found Aaliyah in the crowd. A soft smile played on Aaliyah's lips, encouraging Mrs. Jenkins to continue. "But life has a funny way of teaching us lessons," Mrs. Jenkins went on. "Years later, that same child, now grown into a remarkable woman, showed me what true forgiveness looks like." Mrs. Jenkins paused, taking a deep breath. "Dr. Aaliyah Lewis, would you please stand?" Surprised, Aaliyah rose to her feet. All eyes turned to her as Mrs. Jenkins continued. "This amazing doctor not only treated my arthritis with skill and care, but also gave me something I never thought I'd have, a second chance. Her forgiveness allowed me to see the error of my ways and inspired me to become a better person." Tears glistened in Mrs. Jenkins' eyes as she looked directly at Aaliyah. "Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for showing me that change is always possible, no matter how late in life it comes." The room erupted in applause, and Aaliyah felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected this public acknowledgement, but the genuine gratitude in Mrs. Jenkins's voice touched her deeply. As the clapping died down, Mrs. Jenkins concluded her speech with a powerful message. "If there's one thing I want you all to take away from my story, it's this. It's never too late to change, to make amends, and to choose kindness. We all have the power to make a difference, just like Dr. Lewis did for me." As the community event came to a close, Aaliyah felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. The journey that had begun years ago in a small daycare had come full circle, touching not just her life but the lives of many others. A few days later, Aaliyah found herself standing on Mrs. Jenkins's front porch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly kept garden. She knocked gently on the door, a small bouquet of daisies in her hand. Mrs. Jenkins opened the door, her face lighting up at the sight of Aaliyah. "Dr. Lewis, what a wonderful surprise," she exclaimed, her voice warm and welcoming. Aaliyah smiled, handing her the flowers. "I thought I'd stop by for a visit, if that's all right." Mrs. Jenkins ushered her in, leading her to a cozy living room. The walls were adorned with photos of smiling children from the community center. They sat down, a comfortable silence settling between them. "I never thought I'd be sitting here with you like this," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, her eyes misty with emotion. "After everything?" Aaliyah reached out and patted Mrs. Jenkins's hand gently. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Your forgiveness, it changed everything for me. I don't know if I can ever truly express how grateful I am." Aaliyah smiled, her own eyes glistening. "Forgiveness isn't just for the person being forgiven. It heals the one who forgives too. My mom taught me that, and now I understand it more than ever." They sat together, two women whose lives had been intertwined in ways they never could have imagined. The room was filled with a sense of peace and gratitude, a testament to the healing power of forgiveness. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, Aaliyah and Mrs. Jenkins shared a quiet moment of reflection. Their journey had shown them both that no matter how far one might fall, redemption was always within reach. It was a powerful lesson, one that would continue to shape their lives and the lives of those around them for years to come. If you enjoyed the story of Mrs. Jenkins and Aaliyah, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.